Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody. How are you? Hi, Dolores. Steve Gonzo. Hi, Jim. Hi, Kathy Langan. Amber Lee. How you doing? Russell Gallman. What is the 25th Amendment and how is it triggered? I'll say something about that later. But hi, Russ. How are you? Russell Gallman asked that question. And Kay is joined. Hi, Kay. Nice to see you as well. Okay, let's get right to it. Well, first I should remind everyone to share, 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 please. And of course, please occasionally remember my Patreon account, okay, at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And thank you for anything you can manage. Okay, at this point, it's greatly appreciated. And if you're not able to manage anything, that's fine too. I know it's hard times for everybody right now. So, let's get right to it. I have a number of subjects I want to talk about tonight. The first one is covered by the title of the first article. The name of it is The Tyranny of Decorum. And the article was written by Dave Sirota, who was a speechwriter for Bernie Sanders, very high up in the campaign, and who was one of those who wanted Bernie to run a more aggressive campaign than he ran. And Dave wrote a blog, okay, a few days back, where he was quite explicit about his feelings. He started a blog on Substack, and the title of the blog is Too Much Information, and I urge you to subscribe. It's very, very good. But Dave is really a good writer. He publishes in a lot, okay, of places. He's been around for a very long time. When he first broke in, he worked for Bernie in Congress for a while. After that, he went off on his own. He was writing quite a lot, active in politics. His wife is active in politics too, and I believe is a member of the state legislature, the state house in Colorado. If I'm not mistaken, I think her name, okay, is Elizabeth Sirota, again, if I recall correctly. So Dave starts off his piece, which he subtitles A Look Back on the 2020 Primary, and he says, I've known Bernie Sanders for 21 years. He's been a hero for me. And then he goes on with fulsome praise, okay, of Bernie Sanders. And then says, what follows are some frank takeaways from the campaign. We did not run a perfect race, and having worked on both winning and losing campaigns, I accept my share of responsibility for that. Oh, I'm afraid that I have blinked out. I think you can still hear me, though. Hopefully that's just a moment. Okay, I'm back. And back to Dave's piece. Lord knows I was hardly perfect, and from the very beginning until the very end, I've taken my share, criticism. But I believe that we have an obligation to look back on the painful past because we must always try to learn lessons for the future. I believe that too. The only way you really learn lessons is by making errors. And if you're wise, if you're smart, you're going to learn from errors. So the first thing you have to do is admit those errors, of course. And then you have to change. If what you did before doesn't work, you have to figure out how to change. I'm kind of an expert on that subject because I did a lot of work in the knowledge management field. And okay, I had my own theory of learning that I worked with, which is a derivative of Karl Popper's ideas on how we learn. I love Karl Popper's work, and his work is completely in line with what Dave Sirota had to say here. So I'm afraid my camera's gone south again. So I'm hoping this is just easy. Yes, it is. So I'm back. And I think you could hear me all that time. My sound was not off. So good for that. So Dave starts off, if you've read the autopsies of the Bernie 2020 campaign in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed, I went by BuzzFeed, or CNN, you've probably read a version of the story that goes something like this. Pollster Ben Tolchin, co-chair Nina Turner, and I were fire-breathing monsters aggressively pushing Bernie to attack Joe Biden. And Bernie refused to do it, and that's why Bernie lost. He forgot to mention the other fire breather, whose name is um, um, actually Brianna Joy Gray, known on Twitter as Bree Rejoy, and she was kind of a fire eater too, and has been playing in the post game, talking about what some of the things were the campaign actually did wrong, and laying out Joe Biden's record while she's at it. Anyway, Dave goes on. He says, there are some nuggets in here, but there's also some fiction. And so it is worth separating the facts from the fantasy in order to understand a huge but little discussed problem plaguing the Democratic Party that I call the tyranny of decorum. So that's where part of the title of this live stream comes from. And Dave goes on, yes, it is true. A small group of us with many years of campaign experience pushed Bernie to sharply contrast his own progressive record with Biden's record of working with Republicans against the Democratic agenda. I've been on 7 underdog challenger campaigns in my life and won a few of them. This is campaigning 101. You contrast or you lose. And with Biden, the contrast was particularly stark. Just a footnote here. How did Ocasio-Cortez win? She won through contrasting what she wanted to do and what she believed in with Joe Crowley's mediocre record. And then she campaigned from door to door on this contrast. And that's how she upset Joe Crowley in that particular campaign. Okay, and what other progressive folks have done, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, they campaigned on their ideas, okay, and on their agenda, and they compared themselves to their opponents. And when Presley ran, she ran contrasting herself with her opponent, who actually was a fairly progressive guy, but who had forgotten a little bit about the home front and who was not as radical as he needed to be. And so she won her race as well in that way, through contrast. Okay, and Dave says you contrast or you lose, and with Biden the contrast was particularly stark. And then Dave summarizes the contrasts. While Bernie was fighting to stop the Iraq war, Biden helped the GOP pass the Iraq war resolution and voted down the Democratic amendments but to the resolution, and Dave could have gone on. Biden also praised George Bush's conduct of the war a few times after we went to Iraq and began to fight that war, which we should never have been in the first place. Going on, while Bernie was fighting to stop the bankruptcy bill, Biden helped the Republicans pass the legislation that would now crush hundreds of thousands of Americans during the coronavirus recession. Of course, it's not a recession in my mind. Okay? It's a depression. I mean, 1/3 of the economy appears to be collapsing right now. Okay. I think with the number of unemployed we have now, which we'll get to later, it can certainly be fairly classified as a depression. But anyway, going on, it's not just crushing hundreds of thousands of Americans during the recession. The bankruptcy bill that Biden helped to pass has been crushing hundreds of thousands of Americans every single year since then, coupled with the problem, of medical debt and home foreclosures. We're looking at, 500,000 per year who have been declaring bankruptcy due to medical debt alone. Each year since, and when they declare bankruptcy, guess what? They cannot discharge their credit card debts in bankruptcy. That's what Joe Biden did for us. That's what he did for middle-class Americans and for working-class Americans. He made the banks invulnerable to bankruptcy. Amazing. And he brought over quite a few Democratic votes in doing that. While Bernie and Paul Wellstone were pushing a bill to lower the price of drugs and prevent profiteering off vaccines developed at taxpayer expense, Joe Biden was helping Republicans kill the initiative. Now, Paul Wellstone, of course, goes back actually quite a ways. It's been quite a long time since Paul Wellstone was killed in a crash. He was very famous, as a progressive senator from the state, of Minnesota, by the way. And he died in a plane crash while campaigning. Very, very tragic. And as I told MSNBC, says Dave, while Bernie was fighting to protect and expand Social Security, Biden was helping to echo the Republican arguments for cutting Social Security. And of course, we know that at least on 5 separate occasions, Joe Biden was arguing for cutting Social Security or cutting entitlements in general, including Medicare, and Medicaid. And the latest occasions, on which he did this were as vice president during the Obama administration. Dave goes on, even though Biden at times, sorry, I scrolled too fast, but pathologically lied about some of these facts. At one point, he actually insisted he didn't help write his own bankruptcy bill. That is pathologically lying, by the way. I think that's a fact. This record is verifiable. It is not in dispute, says Dave. There were a group of us who believed it was important for this record to be spotlighted because it was good strategy and good for democracy. And not only that, if Joe Biden was not subjected to criticism and to his own errors, if he was not actually reminded of his own errors, but Joe Biden would be all the more vulnerable to Donald Trump's attacks. But even worse, if he wasn't made to recognize his errors, and he did make it to the presidency, he might very well repeat the same kinds of errors that he committed throughout his career. And by the way, this short summary is only a very short summary of Dave's. It doesn't go into everything that Biden did wrong. It doesn't even mention the crime bill. It doesn't even mention the treatment, okay, of Anita Hill. It doesn't mention working with the segregationists back in the 1970s. Dave goes on. We didn't push Bernie to attack Biden in some sort of vicious way. We pushed him to instead simply and very explicitly cast the primary as a choice between a vision of progressive change and Biden's promise to his donors that, quote, nothing will fundamentally change, unquote. I think that the idea that Bernie did not contrast himself with Joe Biden on all these issues was political malpractice as well as political suicide in this particular campaign. And those of us who supported Bernie with hundreds of dollars over a period of time did not support Bernie so he could act in this way. We did not support him for that reason. We expected a candidate who was touting a revolution to act like a revolutionary, at least to the extent that he would contrast the record on the facts, his own record, with his opponent's record. Dave admits, he says, to his credit, Bernie at times worked with us and embraced the strategy. And when he did, it was successful. See his Social Security contrast with Biden in Iowa. And see his contrast with Wine Cave Pete in New Hampshire. And by the way, in both of those states, Bernie overcome what surely was rigging. The rigging in the caucus due to Pete's app, which somehow found its way into the hands of the Iowa State Party, and they used that app. And then the rigging in New Hampshire, where the exit polling showed a great gap between the exit polls and the final results in just those counties in New Hampshire, those precincts, those districts, or whatever they call them, in New Hampshire, where there were voting machines rather than paper ballots. That's where the gaps were. In the other areas of New Hampshire, where there were paper ballots, there were no gaps. So Bernie overcame rigging in both of those states by contrasting. At other times, though, says Dave, the campaign backed off and did not seize opportunities to explicitly and continually spell out big differences between the candidates. Ultimately, Biden was able to avoid having constantly try to explain his offensive record. Yes, very offensive, enormously offensive. Instead, he was allowed to depict himself as a safe, electable, by unity candidate. Unity, our collective ass. Was it fun to always be one of the people pushing the campaign to be more aggressive and also eating shit on Twitter for supposedly being toxic for simply tweeting a few videos of Biden pushing some grotesquely retrograde policy? No, it was not fun. I have more gray hair and less stomach lining because I pushed. I'm no hero. I'm not a martyr. But I can tell you it was awful, excruciating, and heartbreaking. But it was necessary. Would we have won had we consistently contrasted with Biden? If we're going to play shoulda, woulda, coulda, I'd love to say yes. However, I can't say that with total confidence because there are so many variables and because Biden was an extremely powerful primary candidate, even if he may not have seemed like it to the average onlooker. I am not the average onlooker, I don't think, and I don't think many of us are the average onlooker. But, okay, in my opinion, I can say with total confidence that if Bernie had consistently contrasted himself with Joe Biden in debate after the debate from the beginning of the campaign, even before Joe Biden made the decision to enter, as soon as the debate started, I don't think Joe Biden would have survived that campaign, because he would have been put continually on the spot, and given his level of cognitive decline, he could not have survived. But regardless of whether he could have survived or not, he had to be tested in that way, because if he couldn't survive that kind of contrast from Bernie Sanders, he certainly would not be able to survive the factual and non-factual and ridiculing contrasts that Donald Trump is going to subject him to. But going on with the article, let's remember, in the last 65 plus years, no current or immediate past vice president has ever mounted a serious run for president and not successfully secured his party's nomination at least once. That obscure stat evinces a core truth. If given the choice, voters of both parties almost always opt to nominate people who are a heartbeat away from the presidency. And incredibly, with all the talk about electability, they have done this even though vice presidents don't have a great record, in general elections. The reason why I don't find this too persuasive is because Joe Biden was losing. He lost in Iowa. Was very unimpressive there. He lost in New Hampshire. Very unimpressive there. He was beaten badly when it came to Nevada. Terribly unimpressive there. No one in history had won the first three primaries before, other than Bernie Sanders. That was the first time it had been done. Would Joe Biden have lost in South Carolina? I don't know whether he would have lost in South Carolina. I suppose he would not have under the circumstances. But we can hardly avoid the conclusion that he was helped to run away with things in South Carolina because of the intervention of Jim Clyburn, the Democratic member of the House leadership, who is a leader of, he's the primary leader, of but people who are black Democrats in South Carolina. He's a boss who is local to that particular state, has very dominant influence. When he went all in for Joe Biden, that's what accounted for the runaway there. But Biden would not even have been in a position to benefit so greatly from that if Bernie had been contrasting consistently Joe Biden's record with his own record when it came to civil rights, when it came to doing things for poor people, and particularly for blacks. in the United States. Joe Biden has a terrible record on that front, okay, on issues of great importance to blacks. And Bernie didn't even attack him on the crime bill. What has done more injury to blacks in this country than Joe Biden's crime bill? Bernie let him off the hook on that. If he had been hammering him on that from the first of the debates all through the campaign, I don't think Biden would have done so well in South Carolina. He might still have won with an endorsement from Clyburn, but I'll tell you, it would have been a lot closer. And he would have gone into Super Tuesday greatly weakened by that. I'm fairly certain Biden would not have won this because Bernie would have really destroyed him on the record, just on the record, in a completely fair way without any personal attacks. Going on, as a former vice president who once bragged about being one of the most conservative lawmakers in the Senate, Biden had the support of much of the corporate-aligned party establishment as well as the billionaire class that correctly saw Bernie as an unprecedented existential threat to their economic interests. That establishment, though it may be weaker than ever, is still enormously powerful. Excuse me a second. And that's especially true because so much of the media often echoes its goals and objectives. Some examples. CNN likened Bernie to the coronavirus. MSNBC ran an all-out campaign against us. Absolutely true. Self-described, quote, fact-checkers, unquote, insidiously obscured the facts and deflect criticism of Biden's very clear record. Okay, and as Politico reported, Biden enjoyed nearly 72 million in almost completely positive earned media in the pivotal days leading up to Super Tuesday. Yes. Maybe a sharper contrast could have overcome this. Maybe not. I'm not sure. I am. Sorry, Dave. I think it would have been sufficient. If Bernie had unleashed Phil Agnew, Killer Mike, and Nina Turner to campaign in the South for him, on the record, but aggressively, pulling no punches, I don't think Biden would have had such a large majority in Alabama even, and in many of the other southern states. Biden didn't look like he was electable going into South Carolina. Even coming out of South Carolina, he didn't look like he was very electable. How much less electable would he have seemed in the face of that contrast week after week during the campaign? Dave goes on, I'm confident, however, the strong contrast would have at least put us in a better position to survive when Beto, Amy Klobuchar, and Wine Cave Pete all fell in behind Biden to help him seal Super Tuesday. In absence of a rough critique early on and with no day-to-day focus on his record, Biden was able to solidify an electability argument he did not either deserve or earn. According to exit polls, Biden was able to win the largest share of Democratic voters in 15 states who said health care was their number one priority, even though a majority of Democratic voters in those states said they support replacing private insurance with a government-run plan which is a position that Biden opposes. Bernie didn't make it clear that Biden opposed Medicare for all, that he opposed a single-payer plan. No, Bernie didn't make that clear in state after state. He didn't make that clear in the debates. He said what he was for, but he didn't continuously contrast himself with Joe Biden in the debates and in the campaigns that he ran. And by the way, as long as we're on the exit polls, if the exit polls were valid for the issues, like the healthcare issue, why weren't they valid as a predictor of how the elections were going to turn out? If you think that the results of the exit polls were definitive when it came to Medicare for all as the top issue, why don't you think that they were definitive when it came to the results of the voting of Biden versus Bernie? Could it be that the exit polls were valid and that the gap between the exit polls and the actual results was a measure of the machine rigging in those states? And if that could be a possibility, then why don't you mention it, Dave? Why don't you mention it? The public deserves the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the truth is, if the exit polls should be paid attention to on the issues, the opinions of people expressed in those polls should also be considered to be valid when it comes to who they favored for president. Going on, Biden won the Midwest states that had been ravaged by the trade deals that he himself supported. Biden even won the most Democratic voters in 11 states who said climate was their top issue, despite his far weaker plan. Okay, and again, the same comment, applies here. If the exit polls can be trusted, if they can be trusted about how much concern people have over the climate in those 11 states, then why was Biden, who had a joke of a climate plan, why did he win in most of those states, as opposed to Bernie? Could it be that the vote was rigged in those states? Going on. By the time our campaign was finally comfortable consistently making a strong state against him, it was after Super Tuesday, and it was too late. It was too late because of the coronavirus, I think, becoming more and more important. Yes, but it was too late. The contrast should have been made through the whole campaign. And then Dave gets to the important point of his article. If you've read this far, I know what you're wondering. What explains Bernie's resistance to more sharply contrasting with Biden? In my opinion, three things, with the third being the condition that is the greatest problem for the future. One, Bernie is deeply principled, but he's not a scorched earth politician, and he never has been. Since he was first elected to a public office, His approach is one that seems defined by a belief that to make real change from the outside, you must push harder, but always maintain one foot inside the power structure and not try to burn it all the way down. That calculation is that if you are too adversarial with respect to the establishment, you'll be instantly marginalized, depicted as irrelevant and disempowered. And then he puts in a side note, as the primary results show, the problem with this theory is that even if you are nice and don't go scorched earth, the power structure has other ways to defeat people who are progressive. Absolutely right. And then 2, as he himself said, Bernie likes and respects Joe Biden. I personally don't believe that affinity is justified, says Dave, considering the legislative record of Biden. But I'm not going to litigate that point, okay? It is what it is. Yeah, you but can't account for personal feelings too well. 3, the Democratic Party has manufactured a culture that creates the conventional wisdom and perception that any efforts to contrast opponents' records from the left in a primary is negative and therefore destructive. Yes, they've cultivated that culture for a long time. And it's up to us to simply deny that culture, to rail against it, okay, to critique it, to indicate what is true, that it prevents the party from learning about its mistakes and from adapting to their mistakes. The party won't talk about its mistakes from the inside. And as a result, it cannot adapt to those mistakes. And those mistakes make the party's candidates very vulnerable from the outside. For example, of course, the Affordable Care Act was a mistake. It cost the Democrats. Okay. It was a mistake, but from a political point of view. It was political malpractice. It was at first extremely unpopular. It cost the Democrats in the election of 2010 that and a stimulus bill that was too small to be fully effective. Those two things cost the 2010 election, which the Democrats lost in the House. In the 2012 election, the Democrats won, but they didn't regain the House. The Affordable Care Act was still unpopular in 2012, and the economy had not recovered sufficiently to make people happy. They preferred the president to Romney. They viewed the president as the lesser evil, so he won. However, the Democrats did not improve their position. They still were behind in the House, and the Republicans were gaining strength in the Senate. What did the Democratic Party do with respect to the Affordable Care Act? During this period, health care was still the main issue because the Affordable Care Act was unsatisfactory to people. So what did people do? What did people in the Democratic Party do? Most of the people just said, we're going to fix the Affordable Care Act. I mean, this Affordable Care Act was a wonderful thing. It was the greatest thing in 100 years. We overcame great odds in order to pass the Affordable Care Act. So we have to protect it. And they huddled around protecting the Affordable Care Act. And they basically ran on that. What did they run on in 2016? They ran on enhancing the Affordable Care Act and basically said, you will never get Medicare for all. They had a terrible record on trade. Obama was still campaigning for the passage of the TPP, hurting Hillary Clinton every day of that campaign because he was still pushing the TPP, still identifying the Democrats with free trade and all the jobs that were lost in those Midwestern states. What the Democrats did was huddle together and admit no wrong and admit no lesson learned. And they lost in 2016. They blamed it on Bernie and on Russiagate. They would not blame it on their huddling around policies that had failed to give people what they needed. Now, by then, the Affordable Care Act was more popular. It was more popular than nothing. More popular than nothing. But it still was nothing to write home about. It was nothing people were going to go to the polls to ensure that nothing disturbed the Affordable Care Act. What if Hillary Clinton had run on H.R. 676 in 2016? And had passed it as soon as she got into office. Strike that last comment. What if she had run on it in 2016? Do you really think that Donald Trump would have then become the President of the United States? And what if Obama in that campaign had supported her in running on 2016, saying, okay, the Affordable Care Act has done as much as we could with, but now it's time to go for Medicare for all and solve this problem once and for all. Do you really think Donald Trump would have won in 2016 if Hillary Clinton had had that in her campaign? Would he have won in 2016 if Obama had not stubbornly continued pushing those 3 terrible trade deals with the ISDS clauses in them? No way in the world, Jose. No way in the world. Trump would have lost the 2016 campaign. We would not be sitting where we are today. And if Hillary Clinton had been elected and had quickly passed the Medicare for All bill, she could have turned to starting to work on the climate. I mean, I personally think even Hillary campaign and the Hillary Clinton and the elites she represents are not blind to the climate emergency, to the climate danger. They do have some respect for science. If they had gotten the healthcare issue out of the way in 2017, they certainly would have gone after a decent climate bill during the rest of these last 4 years. But they would not even implicitly admit to the errors they had made. They would not learn. How much of that was due to the fact that they didn't get much criticism? That it wasn't proper to criticize them in campaigns. Even in 2016, Bernie ran a gentle campaign. He never made personal attacks on Hillary Clinton. Never. When Barack Obama ran against her in 2008, he was much rougher on her, much more unfair than Bernie was in 2016. I'm not even talking about 2020 and Bernie's lack of hostilities towards Joe Biden. So Dave said, that culture, of course, is a structural factor that lasts beyond the Bernie campaign. And it is a huge problem. And this is really the main point of his article. It is a new tyranny of decorum that aims to convince voters to value etiquette, and pleasantries, and party unity over everything else, even their own economic interests. But let's remember, we have just experienced modern history's first contested Democratic presidential primary in which the candidates declined to seriously criticize each other in any kind of sustained way. There were certainly momentary flashpoints, but compared to past primaries, this was a muted affair. And if you somehow think this primary was uniquely negative, quote unquote, because Bernie once in a while gently mentioned Joe Biden's vote for the Iraq War, you are apparently Rip Van Winkle waking up from a 50-year slumber. You somehow never saw Democratic ads against Howard Dean in 2004. You never saw Hillary Clinton ads depicting Obama as corrupt. And you never heard, the Obama ads and speech portraying Hillary Clinton as a puppet of the corporate lobbyists. And then there are some pictures. Obama bashes Clinton for votes on the Iraq War, and bankruptcy law. So Obama bashed Clinton for her votes on the Iraq War and on the bankruptcy law. And Bernie would not bash Biden for his votes on the Iraq War and the bankruptcy law. I mean, get that. If he had done that, and Obama had complained about that, all Bernie would have had to do is show this headline in an ad. And there's Hillary replying, Barack Obama accepted $200,000 from executives and employees of oil companies. Yes. Fact, not smear. Fact. The opposite dynamic defined the 2020 primary. As the healthcare industry ran ads vilifying Bernie's signature Medicare for All plan, and as a super PAC aired ads suggesting Bernie couldn't win a general election, the tyranny of decorum dominated the candidate discourse. Dave is so right about that. Anytime Bernie so much as made a passing mention of one of Biden's bad votes, there were overwrought accusations that Bernie was, quote, going to go negative, unquote, hand-wringing warnings about the, quote, perils of going negative, unquote, with Team Biden shedding crocodile tears about negative attacks, quote unquote. This transparent bullshit soon became attacks on staffers who dared to point out flaws in Biden's records. Turner and Press Secretary Brianna Joy Gray were routinely demonized on social media. So there, he mentions Bree Joy. And I myself was labeled a toxic, quote, attack dog for the high crime of periodically tweeting links to Biden's speeches in the congressional record. This attempt to scandalize policy criticism supposedly reflected heightened concerns about electability, quote unquote. The idea promoted by Democratic politicians and pundits being that sharp contrasts might weaken the eventual Democratic nominee against the essential threat of Trump. Yes, they might weaken the eventual Democratic nominee if you nominate the person who is not electable because he has a terrible record. That idea was promoted by the politicians and pundits because they wanted to nominate the person who is not as electable, the person with the weaker record, who is therefore not as electable. They wanted to nominate that person. They wanted to nominate Joe Biden because they cared more about defeating Bernie Sanders than they cared about defeating Donald Trump. Some resistance. And yet, history argues exactly the opposite, says Dave. Tough, brutal primaries often end up battle-testing nominees and making them stronger. See President Obama. In the same way, the minor leagues can prepare players for the major league. Brutal intra-party contests subject the eventual standard bearers to training and to learning. They're forced to learn. And they also suss out potential weaknesses at an early point when a party can still make a different nomination choice. Now, I want to emphasize that here. We are still nowhere near the convention. The party can still make a different nomination choice. It is not too late. But Bernie will not bring the record of the party's presumptive nominee to Democrats at large and to the public at large. He will not do that. So we have to do it. We have to do it because it is not too late. Because there is still half of April and May and June and July and half of August at least, and maybe more time available for the Democratic Party to correct its impending mistake. By contrast, primaries dominated by demands for, quote, good decorum, unquote, quote, by unity, unquote, and, quote, decency, unquote, create coronations, and coronations run the risk of creating nominees who are not adequately road-tested and who are only publicly vetted in the high-stakes general election, well after the party could have made a different choice. That is where we are now. A tyranny of decorum has given us a presumptive nominee whose record hasn't been well scrutinized or challenged. I completely agree with this, except for one thing. In spite of what people have been saying, I don't think the primaries are over. The last votes have not taken place. Nearly half the votes in the primaries still remain to be won. And all the votes remain to be cast at the convention. The primary is not over. We have to cast aside good decorum and unity, and perhaps even decency, but I don't think I'd go that far. I'd say good decorum, okay, and unity. I don't want to cast aside decency. I want to present the facts about Joe Biden and keep on repeating those facts until and even at the convention, if we can get the floor of the convention, okay, in order to do that. We have to make this party make a different choice. Because if it doesn't make a different choice, it is going to lose to Donald Trump in the fall. One last thing that's true, says Dave. Contested primaries are good. Now it's true. Democratic cries of, quote, you're being too negative, unquote, and all the overdramatic fainting spells about tweets to C-SPAN videos did work in the primary. The tactics successfully scandalized any legitimate scrutiny of Biden's record to the point where mild criticism of specific votes was instantly depicted as a substance-free, quote, controversy, unquote, about tone. But those same cheap tactics, sorry, lost my place again. Those same cheap tactics, the screaming about the negativity, the whining, the fainting spells, are not going to work when Donald Trump spends $1 billion, he'll probably spend more than that, on negative ads, hammering Biden's votes for NAFTA and the bankruptcy bill, votes that Biden could have been better prepared to deal with had they been litigated in the primary. He may still be able to beat Trump, and I've said I hope he does. But the comparatively soft primary did not strengthen him for the general election. Absolutely true. But we, folks, we can help to strengthen him for the general election if that is possible, by understanding that this primary hasn't ended and that we can use social media to present the record that so far has not been presented to the public. To look ahead beyond 2020, we can't allow this stifling worship of decorum to define the political culture of the Democratic Party. We must remember that intra-party contrast is good in primaries. Hillary bashing Obama was good. Obama bashing Hillary was good. The same goes for down ballot races. There was a tough primary against Joe Lieberman in Connecticut, where a guy by the name of Governor Lamont ran a tough primary against Joe Lieberman. That was good. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ending Joe Crowley's political career was good. The 2020 primary was pleasant, civil, and polite, and that's bad. We're in the midst of unpleasant, uncivil, and impolite emergencies that threaten our country and our planet. There's a global pandemic that won't be stopped by niceties. The corporations profiting off the healthcare crisis won't be thwarted with good manners. The fossil fuel judgments intensifying the climate cataclysm won't be deterred by gentility, and elections will not be won by prioritizing good decorum over everything else. And I'd add there, they won't be won without having an army of lawyers contesting every damned election in every damned state to make sure that there was no machine rigging or rigging of any other kind. And that's for David Sirota, who hasn't once actually mentioned the rigging or the voter suppression in this past campaign. In short, preventing a real contrast and a real conflict over ideas only serves the establishments and its politicians, who know that scrutiny will weaken their power to decide nomination contests and control the future. But winning nomination contests without real vetting not only serves corporate power, it also jeopardizes that much vaunted quality that parties claim to care so much about. General election electability, quote unquote. Sirota, he signs it. And he says, P.S. If you're interested in more insights about the campaign, click here to watch this interview I did this week with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. And then you can click a button to subscribe, and I've given the link in the description, along with the links to many other things. I won't be able to go over all those things tonight, obviously, because I spent so much time on this important article. But Steve says, it's over, Doc. Come on. Any convention will be a virtual coronation. It may be. It may be, Steve. But I'm telling you, if we can drive down Biden's poll numbers between now and then, the party's going to have to face up to reality. It's going to have to face up to the fact that there's no way Biden's going to win. It's going to have to face up to the fact that it's nominating a loser. And we gain when that happens. if they are perceived by the public to have deliberately nominated a loser, that could well be the death knell for the Democratic Party. And that is a very good thing for us, or would be a very good thing for us. Going on. Common Dreams had an article. I want to go into some news now, pointing out that even Republican voters support $2,000 a month in payments during the coronavirus crisis. That is the result of a poll. I'll share the screen on that article. It was written by Owen Higgins, Common Dreams, on April 16th. And it reports that there's a majority of Americans, including over half of Republican respondents, who support a monthly $2,000 universal basic income check to help defray the effects of the ongoing coronavirus outbreak on the U.S. economy, according to new polling from Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative Institute. According to the poll, a wealth tax proved most popular among all respondents in a follow-up question, which were presenting options for paying for the universal basic income by UBI policy. I don't know why Data for Progress was playing the how you're going to pay for it game, but anyway, they were. Quote, said historian Rutger Bregman on Twitter, by UBI and taxing the rich, to ideas whose time has come. These results were reported in The Appeal, a new publication, fairly new publication. Our polling found that 68% of the public prefers receiving a preloaded debit card to a deduction on next year's income tax. That was a tough choice, right? This includes a majority of both Democrats, 73%, and Republicans, 65%. 65% of Republicans. Imposing a wealth tax was supported the most from the public, followed by adding to the deficit and then by using new currency. There was even new currency mentioned. Platinum coin, anybody? Hello, somebody. Republicans preferred adding the deficit the most. And Republicans preferred, and Democrats preferred the wealth tax the most. And Rashida Tlaib, and we'll talk about her later also, who's been at the forefront of efforts to provide a UBI to everyone in the United States during the pandemic, said on Twitter that the polling reflects a national mood on the benefit. And she tweeted, okay, that there's a majority of Americans who know what I've been saying from the start on this. One-time payments to a portion of the population simply aren't enough to get us through this crisis. And she had a tweet on that in which she mentions, that's why Representative Jayapal and I are introducing the ABC Act. We talked about the ABC Act, okay, a few times here, and we'll go into it, okay, a little further, but there's a little graphic on it here in this article. So, anyway, those are the polling results. We'll get back to the ABC Act, okay, in a little while, but I want to go on and point out that there's an Ilhan Omar bill, also that would cancel all rent and mortgage payments for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis. This was reported on April 17th in an article by Jake Johnson, staff writer for Common Dreams. And her legislation was unveiled on Friday. And it's supposed to help people currently at risk of housing instability and homelessness by canceling all rent and home mortgage payments for the duration of the pandemic. And to quote her, the coronavirus is more than just a public health crisis, it's an economic crisis. And she pointed out that in her state, of Minnesota, people are losing their jobs, getting their hours reduced, and struggling just to put food on the table. So we must take the major action to protect the health and economic security of the most vulnerable people. And she goes on that way, but her legislation, titled the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, would not really suspend rent payments temporarily and require payments to pay back rent when the coronavirus subsides. The bill, as her office emphasized in a summary, quote, would constitute a full payment forgiveness with no accumulation of debt for renters or homeowners and no negative impact on their credit rating or rental history, unquote. Terribly, terribly important, okay, and a wonderful bill. Okay, and the legislation will establish a relief fund for landlords and mortgage holders to cover losses. Okay, it would be of course, it would be a fund that would be underwritten by the federal government. She outlined her bill in a live stream press conference on Friday. There's a video on that here. I'm not going to play the video because I want to get on. But it's important that the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act is co-sponsored by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York and Rashida Tlaib and Pramila Jayapal and Mark Pocan, Ayanna Pressley, Democrat of Massachusetts, also Veronica Escobar, Democrat of Texas, Jesus Garcia, Democrat of Illinois, and Grace Mung, who's a Democrat of New York, and by the way, who was in the Joe Crowley camp. So somebody from the Joe Crowley camp is here in solidarity with the squad and other progressive Democrats on this bill. The bill was also endorsed by dozens of advocacy groups on the progressive side, including People's Action, the Center for Popular Democracy, and the National Coalition for the Homeless. And there's a quote from there basically praising the bill and calling on Congress to quickly pass it. Next, staggering. The unemployment claims climb to 22 million as the U.S. remains the epicenter of the global pandemic. That was written by Jessica Corbett on April 16th. That was Thursday. That's when the unemployment figures came out. 22 million Americans have filed jobless claims since the middle of March, as the United States has become the epicenter of the global coronavirus pandemic, with over 30% of the world's more than 2 million confirmed cases. So notice, that's 22 million. But a question. It's easy to pose a question here. And that question is, there are 170 million roughly in the labor force. Before the crisis hit, U3 unemployment was at 3.5%. How many million people is that? Answer, 5.95 million people. Rounding off. 6 million people. Rounding off. How many unemployed Americans are there now? 28 million people. 28 million people. Asking the question, what's the unemployment rate at this point? Calculation is very easy. Unemployment rate is 16.5%, roughly, at present. That's the U3 unemployment rate. We don't have an official announcement on that from the DOL that I was able to find, but probably by the end of the month there will be such an announcement, except it will be even greater because we still have another week in April to go, at least. Okay. Actually, we have another 2 weeks in April to go. So we'll probably get that figure in May, in early May. And we'll probably find, it's even more. But if it was stopped now, it would be at 16.5%. That already greatly exceeds the maximum rate for the recession of 2008 and 2009, which was, if I recall correctly, roughly 10.4%. So we are already at U3 rates that rival those of the Depression of the 1930s. We are in a depression, folks, as measured by unemployment rates. We are in a depression. Some economists say the unemployment rate could reach as high as 20% in April. Okay, that's a quote from the AP, which would be the highest rate since the Depression of the 30s. This 16.5% is the highest rate since the Depression of the 30s. And there, the AP notes, by comparison, unemployment never topped but 10% during the 2008-2009 period. I think it did top 10% by just a little. I think it was 10% and a fraction. But anyway, that's a depression that we're in. We have to start calling it that. We have to start naming it a depression. The 22 million people is a distortion. It's at least 28 million people right now. Because those other 6 million people, guess what? They didn't find new jobs. Very few of them found any new jobs. And so, Pramila Jayapal declared in response to DOL report, we need my Paycheck Guarantee Act passed. Her proposal, introduced last week, has the support of labor unions and small business advocates. Sorry, that's my camera once again. Okay, so my camera went off. This might be a quick restore. It might take a few more seconds, so hope for the best. There it is. I'm back. So, that's where we are. Oh, by the way, I got to share this latest one. Excuse me while I share it. The measure would allow companies nationwide to fully cover their employees' salaries of up to $100,000 annually, following the lead of similar schemes in other countries around the world, I'm sorry, there goes my camera once again. I'm back again. So, our country has long been ridiculed for being the world's only industrialized nation that doesn't have universal health care, but criticism of the inadequate for-profit U.S. system has ramped up as the coronavirus has ravaged the country, killing at least 31,000 people. As of this morning, John Campbell noted that 37,000 people had died in this country. The global death toll for COVID-19 is over 139,000. We have a major share of that global death toll, don't we? EPI's Ben Zipper and Josh Bivens on Thursday estimated 9.2 million U.S. workers have likely lost their employer-provided health insurance in the past 4 weeks and urged the federal government to fund an expansion of Medicare and Medicaid to those suffering job losses during the pandemic period. So Heidi Scherholz of the EPI says that the coronavirus the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, the CARES Act, that Congress passed in March, quote, had some crucial provisions in it, but it is no match for the damage the economy is facing, and federal policymakers need to do more, unquote. And she points out that the next relief and recovery package needs to provide aid to state and local governments, extend unemployment benefits, has to provide also better protections for workers and jobs, and include funding to safeguard our democracy, the economist added. And importantly, we cannot turn off the federal government relief too early. At this point, it appears, she said, that even under the best-case scenario, a rapid bounce back in the second half of the year, the unemployment rate will still be close to 10% in the fourth quarter of this year, she concluded. If it's at 10% in the fourth quarter of this year, Trump stands a good chance to lose if there's a decent candidate against him. If Joe Biden's against him, though, I have no idea what's going to happen. Quote, Congress has the power to dramatically mitigate the suffering associated with the coronavirus shock, and they have an obligation to exercise it, unquote. Absolutely right, they do. Okay, this brings us again to Rashida Tlaib. Her bill is now out. It was introduced jointly by Tlaib and Pramila Jayapal. So the bill now belongs to both of them. Okay. Also, Jayapal, remember, is the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, which now has something like 85 Congresspeople in it. And I've given you the link to it. They introduced groundbreaking bill to deliver universal recurring payments for COVID-19 relief. The Mint the Coin proposal would provide $2,000 per month during the crisis and $1,000 a month for a year afterwards to every person in America. And we've mentioned this before, going over the main features before. I'll repeat again, it would be funded directly from the Treasury with no additional debt issued by minting 2 $1 trillion coins. And additional coins as necessary. So it's not going to add to the national debt for the terrorists who would normally say, what are we going to do about the debt? The debt. This won't add to the national debt. Won't add to the debt subject to the limit because it's going to be funded by two $1 trillion coins. There's a lot in the news release, and I'll leave it to you to read, but okay, a quote from Congresswoman Tlaib. Quote, "This means we need to help our neighbors pay their bills, purchase groceries, and other quality of life needs. The ABC Act is designed to help cushion these blows during and after this global health crisis while chipping away at economic inequality in our society during this pandemic," unquote. Okay, Jayapal has a nice quote here too. And according to polling released by Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative Institute, that's the polling that I just cited in the earlier article, and they give the results here, okay, in this particular release. It's good to see a polling organization working in tandem with Congresspeople to support a bill which has been introduced with facts, with polling data, pointing out to people in Congress, the American people want this. A majority of Democrats want this. A majority of Republicans want this. 65% of Republicans want this. So this is what they meant by new currency. When 24%, they favor doing it through new currency. So Rashida Tlaib recently led 57 members of Congress in a bicameral push for including recurring basic income payments as part of Congress's next economic response to the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm sure this is being watched very carefully by Shahid Buttar in his race against Nancy Pelosi in California. Because if she fails to push and pass this act in the House as part of a relief package for the act, she's going to be subject to criticism by Shahid Buttar. She's going to have to run on her record of blocking the passage of this act. There's a quote from Rohan Gray here, who's now an assistant professor of law, at Willamette University. That's something new. I hadn't seen that before. He's probably still working for his PhD from I don't think it was a PhD. It's probably a law degree from Cornell. So he probably doesn't quite have that yet because it's only April. But he started teaching anyway. So good for Rowan. There's some other praise of the bill here. I won't go through the praise, but I do want to note the bill was also co-sponsored by Jesus G. Chuy Garcia of the Illinois 4th, Alcee Hastings of the Florida 20th, a longtime veteran of the Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton of the District of Columbia, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of the New York 14th, Ilhan Omar of the Minnesota 5th, Ayanna Pressley, Massachusetts 7th. Barbie Rush of the Illinois 1st, Jan Schakowsky of the Illinois 9th, okay, and also by Nydia Velasquez of the New York 7th. The bill is endorsed by the Economic Security Project, by Economic Security Project Action, Unidos US, Strong Economy for All, Americans for Financial Reform, Demand Progress, and the Jane Family Institute, which must be an institute that's supported by those of the Jain persuasion in this country. And there's a link to the text of the bill. I've provided a link to this news release and a link to the text of the bill, okay, in the description, so you have that. I wanted to go through another news release very briefly that she left, and that's on the bicameral push for recurring direct payments during the COVID-19 crisis. And here are the people who have joined the bill. Rashida, of course. U.S. Senator Kamala D. Harris, Democrat of California. And Presley, who was mentioned already. Jamie Raskin, who's a Democrat of Maryland and very progressive. Also, Emanuel Cleaver, longtime veteran of the Congress, a Democrat from St. Louis, Missouri, if I recall correctly. Veronica Escobar, a Democrat from Texas. Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Democrat of New York. And 53 of their colleagues sent a letter to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, to Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican of California, Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, and Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, pushing for recurring monthly cash payments to those most at risk. So this bill now has a lot of visibility and support in both houses, okay, of Congress. And it's a great bill, and we really need to have it passed. It would be monumental if we had it passed. Some other senators who have signed the letter that was endorsed by all 57 included Senator Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont. And the letter and a full list of the signers is given, okay, in a link. And let's see if there are any notable ones I should mention. I did not actually provide a link to this, but you can get it from the news release. Okay, additional House signers. There are 52 additional House signers on this. So it's really pretty big in terms of number of House people on the progressive side who signed it. There's a push in back of this bill. Okay, it doesn't have a majority of the House Democratic caucus as yet, but it's got let's see, 52, 54. Okay, it had actually 60 signers rather than 57. At least that's what I count here. So 60 co-signers. Okay, so that's it. It's got some pushing back of it. Has to get a lot more co-signers. But there's a push behind it. Okay? It's visible. It's going to be at issue in a campaign, specifically in Nancy Pelosi's campaign for re-election to her seat in San Francisco. That can be a pretty big motivator for her to see that this bill gets out of the House. Now, she can probably rely on Mitch to block the bill. But that may prove a little problematic, because with each passing week there's more and more pressure from the unemployed and more pressure from an economy that is tanking, and therefore more and more pressure on Donald Trump to do something, to do anything to turn it around. And here's a bill that can perhaps provide an answer, a partial answer for Donald Trump, at least to make the election competitive. Because this kind of injection into the economy, for most of the people in it, is going to do a lot to make him look good. If he touts this bill and says he supports it, and gets Mitch to support it, and then Trump signs it, maybe this bill can get through. And this, by the way, is the first bill that will have included use of the platinum coin to fund it. And in that sense, it is a revolutionary bill. There was something else I think I missed in the other press release about her use of the $1 trillion coin here. It was described by somebody in the press as something that was very practical, but also as something novel, inventive. But what I think was the most important part of the quote, I'm missing now, that I lost somewhere. Oh, yes. Yes. This is called by the Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy, by UNIDOS, by U.S. He called this, quote, I applaud this practical, inclusive solution that would allow everyone, regardless of income or immigration status, to live in safety and dignity till the crisis is safely behind us. The better we weather the storm right now, the quicker we'll return to work and get our economy humming and communities thriving again. So he's calling this solution, this bill, a practical solution. And this bill includes the means of financing it, specifically the $2 trillion coins. No one, in talking about this bill, is yet calling the bill silly because it calls for $2 trillion coins. Now, most of you may not know this, but there were many of us who fought hard for that to resolve the fiscal crises in the summer of 2011 and the fall and winter of 2012 to 2013. We fought hard for a platinum coin solution. And that fight, in fact, spawned a book that I wrote. It's an ebook, on Amazon. The only book yet written on the platinum coin. And it's called Fixing the Debt Without Breaking America. And then it has a subtitle. It's a long subtitle. I'm not going to go into that one. But anyway, you can find the book and a link to Amazon to get it. Okay, it's an ebook. Okay, it's not expensive. $9, okay, and 99 cents. And it's all about the platinum coin and all the legal issues surrounding it. All the political issues surrounding it, the media issues surrounding it, the implications of the platinum coin for austerity and fiscal crises, okay, and debt crises. It's a very comprehensive look, okay, at the platinum coin. It was revised. It was originally written early in 2013. It was revised in 2014. It's still the only book on the platinum coin. And as such, I think it's the authoritative work on the platinum coin, okay, at this point. Okay, so I commend it to you. I suppose some of you have been to my site by now, josephmfirestone.com, so you can go there and you'll find lots of links to that book. Also, I want to direct you to the text of the bill itself. I've left a link to the text of the bill. Okay. It's a 21-page bill. Okay, it's not a long bill, but you can read the fine print and the innovations in this particular bill. I'll discuss it in more detail at some time in the future when I've had the chance to read the fine print. But anyway, the link to the text is there. You can see it and you can review it for yourselves. Now, I'm still going to go on for some time today because no, I guess I don't have time to go through anymore. So next time, what I'll be doing next time, okay, on Monday, is I'll be going over a very long and significant piece on all of the, I won't call them shenanigans, on all the criminality that is going on now with respect to the bailouts. I'll be talking a lot about that. I'll also be talking about an article in The Guardian which has appeared by Yevhen Rosissian and Randy Ray, which is a warning. It talks about how people now are spending all kind of money to get out of the crisis. And it warns against, again, it warns us to oppose the efforts that will come from many of the same people to turn back the clock and suddenly try to persuade us that we can't afford this, or we can't afford that, or we can't afford, the other thing. Now, they will get us into that position by financing a lot of what has already been passed and a lot of what will be passed by issuing bonds and driving up the national debt. And then, after we're out of the crisis, they'll tear their hair out over how big the national debt figure is, and they'll pretend that the only way to finance things is either go further into debt, okay, or raise taxes. They're going to play that game again. I guarantee it. They're going to play that game again. But not if we can pass the Rashida Tlaib Jayapal bill. If that passes, and the example of the platinum coins is there, then everybody will know that the debt can always be paid off as it falls due with platinum coins. There is no debt issue. They could even finance all the things they're passing now without issuing any Treasury debt securities. They could just use more platinum coins if they want to top up the Treasury spending account to fulfill the appropriations, spending appropriations that Congress is giving to the Treasury Department. The mandated appropriations can be spent using the reserves that eventually get produced by the platinum coin. They buy the $1 trillion coins. So, I'll go through this warning when I next live stream, which will be on Monday night, okay, at 9 o'clock. For tonight, I want to remind you again to share, like, and subscribe. And in addition, I want to consider your comments, which I presume have been quite a few. I'm going to refresh my screen here. Okay, thank you for sharing. There's a fair amount of sharing here tonight. If you could do some more, I'd really appreciate it, okay, as well. I don't know how many comments there have been here, but entertain your comments now. Steve says, it's over, Doc. Come on. And Kay says, I doubt there will be any real convention due to this virus. I don't know. The convention is still scheduled, and the incentive they have to hold the convention is that they make a lot of money from the convention. The establishment makes a fortune from the convention. That's what people have to remember. They make a fortune from the convention. That's what people have to remember. Okay, I just wanted to check I was still streaming. I am. So they may still hold the convention. They don't want to cancel it. They don't want to cancel it. Steve says the time for civility is over. Now it's time for rent strikes, general strikes, and civil unrest. Okay, civility doesn't mean that you cease to contrast, that you cease to argue, that you cease to disagree. It means that you do so civilly. Also, if one determines to be... The incentive they have to hold the convention... Sorry. Also, if one determines that one, is going to argue civilly with people, that doesn't mean that one is not going to have rent strikes and general strikes and protests in the streets. Those things can be done civilly as well. In case you forgot, we have rights to strike. And we have rights to protest. And we have rights to assemble, guaranteed by the Constitution. We can use tools like that to get what we want. Certainly, the authorities will violate the Constitution, but then we have other tools to raise money and to legally challenge them and to make them pay for it. Sandy says they embrace democratic socialism when money is being handed out. Well, actually, what they embrace is a form, of lemon socialism. It's not really democratic socialism. It's the socialism for them that they create through plutocracy and kakistocracy and inverted totalitarianism. And Sandy says, show me the money. Nikki says, hi, Joe and friends. Sandy says, hi, Nikki. Kay says, exactly, Sandy, I'll believe it when I see it. Steve says, I got somebody else's unemployment check in my mailbox today. Wrong address. Even the post office doesn't give a fuck anymore. Sure you want to vote by mail? If there's a proper amount of funding from the Congress, yes. Make sure the Congress supplies the funding. Let's have some platinum coins for the post office. Let's give them enough in platinum coins so they can guarantee their pensions out 50 years. Then they won't have to worry about that anymore. They'll have no trouble being solvent. Steve says, rent strike, general strike, May 1st. Yep. There's a movement to have a May 1st strike. But whether it's in the streets or not is going to be another matter. We'll have to see how it's run. Carmen says, I wonder what nutball liberators have to say about the 2,000 plus rent cancellation. Never mind. They'll never like it because then they can't come out and show their guns. I think for $2,000 they might be persuaded to keep their guns inside for a while. Sandy says $2,000 a month. That usually happens when the regular mail carrier is off or sick. Yeah, it usually does. That's right. Okay, and Nikki says, here in Wisconsin, the post office failed to deliver thousands of mails in ballots to voters. I know, I remember. I remember seeing those boxes, of ballots. Sandy says that's a federal offense. Yeah, but is the Trump administration going to prosecute it? Sandy says, I delivered mail at one time. That is a federal offense. That is, and at one time, the federal government enforced it, didn't they? They don't enforce so much anymore. Excuse me just a second. Thank you. I had a little slip here. Which I have to cure. Okay. And Sandy then says, I agree this is a depression. My husband called it a recession today and I corrected him. Good for you, Sandy. And Nikki said, agreed, that is what it is. Carmen said, well, if we're in a depression, what's the holdup with federal stabilization and anti-depression programs and safety nets? What is DT waiting for? He's waiting for the DTs to take over. I don't know what DT is waiting for. He always likes to play the hero. So why doesn't he do something heroic? So Nikki says, to me, it's like we're going to try to find out what would have happened if FDR hadn't saved capitalism. Kay says, DT doesn't care about anyone but himself. Right. But he seems to want to get reelected in the fall. He does. So he's got to care about how to do that. Carmen Muniz says, the DNC must know by now that Joe is not going to fly. They don't know. They think they can fool everybody for long enough to actually get him the nomination. After that, they don't care, because they don't care. They have the convention. They make their money. Okay, they give him the nomination. They give lots and lots of money to the pundit class, okay, for the election. The pundits are all happy. Their deal flow is all protected. And then after the election, they start talking about the resistance to Donald Trump. Let's get him impeached. Let's get him replaced. Okay, Nikki said, none of the elite or political class care about anything but themselves and their money. True. Margot says, offer to put Trump on the coins, and he'll go for it. Yep. Yep. He might well go for it if he's on the coin. I'd put him on a few coins to get all these good things done. He can have his picture on the frickin' coin. Barbara says, Trump is encouraging his base to protest governors to go back to work. That's his attempt to fix this. But that attempt is not going to work. It's not going to work with the governors. And it's not going to heal the economy anyway. And he's a fool if he tries to do that, because what's going to happen is hundreds of thousands of people are going to die on his watch, and everybody's going to know someone who died. And if they know someone who died, they're not going to vote for him. Sandy says, you would think he had another bad interview. Kay says, agreed, Nikki. Steve says, Doc, have you been watching anomaly shows on the origin of COVID-19, or does it even matter? No, I haven't been watching it. Oh, what does anomaly say? I know there are theories that it originated in a Chinese lab. There are theories, okay, that it originated in a CIA lab. I think the jury's out on where it originated. Carmen says, well, he cares about narcissistic injury, so therefore he will do something. Narcissistic injury destroys narcissists beyond repair. Well, let's hope he is destroyed beyond repair soon, before he destroys us beyond repair. Kay says, I'm wondering if DT's protesters are getting cash for those protests. I don't know. They did look awfully happy doing protests. I mean, I just hope they congregate very close together for these protests. And they hug and kiss each other a lot. Carmen says, from who? Corporations or DeVos? Kay says, both. I've heard the DeVos in Michigan and the Kochs in other places. Jim Bird says, Trump is establishment, and 95% of what he's done in establishment. And the list is long. He has had very little meaningful opposition. Yes. Steve says, I found one of those $1 trillion coins behind the cushion in my couch. Can I spend it in a parking meter? No, Steve. Kay says, Carmen, people need cash. And Carmen says, corporations need cash. We need safety nets and resources. Yes. And we need some cash to get those resources. Angelica Duenas and Shahid Buttar deserve props here in California, even though I'm done with that party. Yep. It's not about the party. It's about them, and they do deserve props. They're great candidates, and I'm for both of them. Angelica I know because I interviewed her at least 2, maybe 3 times. I don't know Shahid personally yet, but I suspect I will before the campaign is over. Kay says, yes, I know, but DT supporters don't think that way. Cash in the hand be better for them. Yes. And Carmen says, yeah, to buy Goldschlager and meth. Kay says, oh, okay. If this country would raise the minimum wage, expand Social Security, and pass Medicare for all, we could get rid of a lot of the so-called safety nets. There'll always be people who will need to have the safety nets. So we can get rid of a lot of people who have to be using the safety nets, but we'd still need the safety nets. And the safety nets are stabilization, are automatic stabilizers for the economy. They even out the cycles. Steve says, I found one of those $1 trillion coins. They won't give me change at a 7-Eleven. Yeah, I know. It's very funny. But of course, what the Federal Reserve does with the $1 trillion coins is it deposits the $1 trillion coins in their vault, and then those $1 trillion coins become assets of the Fed. And what happens is that the accounts of the Treasury accredited with $2 trillion in reserves. So the Treasury doesn't need change, it gets reserves. Kay says, I am sick and tired of dealing with all crap and paperwork and all of it. Just give me enough money to live on in my old age. Carmen says, I'd rather have safety nets in Bernie's platform. Dream come true. Green New Deal. Barbara says, if we find a way to get fair elections, we might actually win this fight. We're going to have to win the fight first and then get the fair elections, because they're not going to pass any fair elections. They're not. We'd have to drag them out and shoot them first. Just a joke, folks. Just a joke. So Margot says, the federal job guarantee would establish a floor for wages, Social Security, and Medicare for all, safety nets. Yeah, it would establish a floor for wages, but it's also a safety net for people who lose their private sector employment. It's a safety net for them. It provides both a job and a floor for wages. And the floor, in theory, should be a living wage. We have to remind people like Bernie Sanders that $15 an hour is no longer a living wage. Kay says, Medicare for all would be a single payer, so no crap to deal with. That's right. No crap to deal with. No paperwork to deal with. All you'd have is your card. You go in and you use it, and the government and the doctors take care of the paperwork. The doctors or providers, other providers. So, if SS were expanded, most of us would be good to go. Well, those on SS would be good to go, yes. If it were expanded to European standards, not simply expanded, okay, as for example, okay, what Elizabeth Warren wants to do with her magnificent expansion is to add $300 to Social Security payments. Good. Carmen Muniz. So when is the truth about MMT going to stop the cruel austerity narrative? Who will finally be the light, the harbinger, okay, of fiat? The light is right here now with the $1 trillion coin. Okay, it's actually Rashida Tlaib is the first one who took it seriously enough to place an MMT narrative into legislation. She is the first one. The platinum coin is a prime example of fiat currency. And its use in her bill is a common sense proof that austerity is never necessary. Never necessary, at least when you have a recession, okay, or have a depression. It may be necessary when you have inflation, but until that time, it's not necessary. Kay says, good to cuss and discuss with you all. Thank you, Kay. Steve says, we love you, Kay. Carmen says, we don't want to give the DNC any more money. Not going to their rigging fete celebration of a faux convention. Barbara Wernick says, Margot Shepard, you're absolutely right about the FJG, but SS and M4A should be rights. Well, entitlements are rights. Are rights. An entitlement is if you're entitled to something, it's your right to have it. So let's take back the definition of something we're entitled to. It's just another way of saying we have a right to it. Rights as an American citizen. The Economic Bill of Rights, okay, an FDR. We are entitled to those rights. We are entitled to the Economic Bill of Rights. And we're going to take it because we're entitled to it. Kay says, get your wine, Joe. I got my beers, laugh out loud. Steve says, I've never signed anything with a T on it. A rum quote. I've never signed anything with a T on it when signing the 2T stimulus. Now we'll give him some other things to sign with T's on it. How did Biden help Scalia and Clarence Thomas get nominated for the Supreme Court? He helped Clarence Thomas get confirmed for the Supreme Court. He didn't help the nomination. I've forgotten what he did for Scalia, but for Clarence Thomas, his nomination hung in the balance because he was accused by Anita Hill, if you recall. And what Biden did is he not only made things for Anita, for Anita Hill when she was testifying, but what he also did is he prevented two corroborating witnesses from testifying. He was holding those hearings. He was chairing those hearings. He could have had the two corroborating witnesses in to have allowed the hearings to establish a pattern of Clarence Thomas sexually harassing women. And he did not do that. He saved Clarence Thomas. Why did he save Clarence Thomas? He saved him because Biden had been instrumental in what they later referred to as the borking of Justice Bork, a very noted conservative jurist at the time who had been previously nominated for the court and was blocked by the Democrats and Biden. So Biden thought that when Clarence Thomas was nominated, that it would look bad if he borked two nominations of George Bush in a row. So he tried to manipulate the situation so that Clarence Thomas would be confirmed, that his nomination would be confirmed before the Supreme Court. I'm not clear. I don't recall exactly what he did in order to get Scalia onto the court. So I'll leave that to you to look up. But I remember very well what he did with Clarence Thomas. Sandy says, I think that platinum coin with Donald Trump's face might be the answer. He's so vain, that would really feed his ego. It would feed his ego, absolutely. And Steve Wolfbrand. Sharon Anthony Connors has joined. Hi, Sharon Anthony. And Bonnie has joined again. Hi, honey. And Kay says, Warren is a joke for a progressive. Yeah, she's really jokey, but I'm not laughing. Steve Wolfbrand said, here in California, we've had homelessness for a decade. Suddenly, they housed everyone. New California. Yeah, Newsom is doing some really good things at this point, isn't he? He seems to actually be trying to do the right thing for a change. Kay says, we could and should house all the homeless everywhere in this country, but there's no money in it for corporations. Nikki says, because they are both sexual deviants. Who? Russ says, I got to call it a night. See you again soon. Thanks for coming, Russ. I'll send you a note on the 25th Amendment. How's that? Steve says, oh, okay. Kay says, Steve says, but Doc, you have a dog? No. I've never had a dog. Never had a dog. Okay. At one point, we had a cat or two, but we never had a dog. I regretted having the cats because they ruined the drapes. I'm not big on household animals. Never have been. Sorry, guys. Kay says, night, Russell. I won't be far behind you. Okay. I still got 23 new comments here. Steve says, borking is a porn category. In those days, it wasn't a porn category. It was a coined name for the vetoing of Justice Bjork for the Supreme Court. That became known, okay, as Bjorking. Okay, it was a political term, and I think then it became a porn category. And Sharon says, hi, Joe. Thanks, Sharon. And Susan Eldridge says, night all. Night, Susan. Hope you enjoyed it. And Carmen says, such a great discussion. I could listen till COVID-19 is over. Thanks, Carmen. I hope it's a short discussion then. And Nikki King says, small price to pay for having cats. Joe, laugh out loud. Yeah, it probably is. Sandy says, so Bonnie did seem to be happy about the cat comment. Well, she laughed about it, but Bonnie actually favored cats. That was part of the reason why we got some cats. And Bonnie likes dogs, too. She had dogs when she was a kid. She had a very nice dog by the name of Bridget when we met. It was very sad when she died. And Carmen Muniz said, like nailing Palin. Well, Palin came later. So the whole history of Bjorking, or borking, was already done. Steve said, I searched the sofa for $1 trillion coin. There's nothing else to do. Okay, so I've taken you all to the end of the comments. Steve says, you should get a dog. Sorry, don't want to get a dog. I'm on Social Security. I don't need to have the expense of a dog. Thank you very much.
$200 for a dog here.
Yeah, it's $200 for a dog, okay, at this particular development. But on top of that, there's the vet for the dog, and there's the insurance for the dog,
And the food.
and feeding the dog, and then
And
there's
the
taking the dog out every damn day. Sorry, guys, I got enough trouble of my own. And Bonnie is laughing here. He's hysterical. Sandy says, I found it, Steve. I think what she found was the $1 trillion coin. Actually, Devora once got me some play currency that said $1 trillion on it.
Yeah, it did.
Okay, so anyway, you all want to get around to reading my book on the $1 trillion coin, because you'll be surprised at how much times have changed. I mean, I've been really very struck since this thing started, because no one has made slimy, smeary remarks concerning the platinum coin. I mean, back in 2013, Ezra Klein was saying, if we mint the platinum coin and take care of the debt ceiling in that way, we'll be like a banana republic. And I had to remind him that what was characteristic of the banana republics was that they didn't have sovereign currencies like the United States, so they could not mint platinum coins. If we don't issue debt, we'll be like a banana republic. Horrors. Barbara Wernick says expense and care. Yes, it's expense and care. Carmen says, get a fish, and when you run out of food, you can eat it. Carmen,
I like Carmen.
once you invest all that emotion, okay, in an animal, you're not going to eat it.
You will if you're real hungry.
I mean, that's one of the problems, you know. You invest your emotion in the animal. I'd much rather invest emotion in a fellow human being. Okay. And as for animals, maybe we should all go vegan, and that would be better for them. Much better. I'm going to say goodnight now, folks, because Bonnie is waving at me. And she wants me to say goodnight. So, have a very good night. And thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing. And I will see you on Monday night. And I'm going to have a smash-up show then, too. So have a really good time. Have a great day tomorrow. And stay safe. Stay really, really safe. And thank you once again.